Deep in the bowels of the Salem, an unhappy congregation of disgruntled soldiers was meeting among each other in the large fitness area on the level of the ship that had been repurposed into a holding area for their temporary off-order guests. "Well, we should be doing something," one of the soldiers was currently shouting at another. "If that was a human colony, we'd already be en route to smoke them out. No questions asked." The other soldier sighed exasperatedly and rolled his eyes. "You can't be this fucking stupid," he countered, lifting his hand and lightly tapping the other's forehead with the back of his fingers. "We ain't talking some measly colony here. He is at a core world, and a fucking old one too. And even if it wasn't, he's at the estate of the Leader Supreme. That tell you anything? It's just the leader of the biggest sovereign communal area in the entire galaxy. What do you think will happen if we just waltz in there?" The first soldier aggressively slapped the hand of his colleague away. "Well, golly gee, forgive me that I don't care much for some Xeno status, or one of our own is in danger," he yelled. And his outburst caused a general wave of annoyed groaning and other disapproving noises to wash through the room. "And there we have it," the second soldier scoffed and shook his head at the other. The first soldier, apparently realizing that he had messed up, immediately began to backpedal. "Alright, listen, that just slipped out of me, he started. However, the surrounding soldiers barely let him get a word in before telling him to shut up, before something else would slip out of him. Shida reached her hands up to shield her ears from the general assault of chattering primates. Why did humans have to be so loud? Nia, who was standing right next to her, gave the feline a compassionate look, before throwing a sharp, disapproving glance at her fellow humans fighting amongst each other. "I am still not sure I completely understand," Moore commented from behind the two of them, using the apparent lack of anything sensible being said for the moment to get in a word of her own. "Are we absolutely sure about this call for help from James? Even having watched his speech one more time after your explanation, I am not certain what you were describing." "It was there, no doubt." Gonglor took it upon himself to answer. "Your eyes aren't half as good as those of humans. Besides, those people are trained to watch out for things like this." "I'm also absolutely sure," Nia concurred with the giant reptilian. "Besides, it's not like James would just run around in such a get-up of his own accord." Moore looked at the two with an expression that clearly showed she had never actually doubted the fact, but was still hoping against hope that it would somehow turn out not to be true. "And what are we going to do about it?" Shida asked, turning one of her ears away from the commotion and towards Nia. Leader Supreme or not, if James was calling for help, there was no way they could just sit by and do nothing. Nia grabbed her right elbow with one hand and ruminatively rubbed her cheek with the thumb of the other. Her dark eyes seemed to be searching the room for something that wasn't anywhere in sight. "Wish I could tell you," she said in an excusatory tone, her own worry about her brother clearly coming through in her voice as well. "But this is a delicate situation. The only one who can make any decision right now are people way up the food chain. All we can do is wait and see what they decide." She seemed to still want to add something. However, she was cut short when the room's door loudly opened, and every yelling soldier in the room shut up at once, as they turned towards the entering person in a near-choreographed-looking fashion, standing still and quiet at attention. Even Nia took up a slightly more respectful position, or at least she stood up a lot straighter as she noticed that the commander of the ship was entering. Commander Keown looked around in the room with a strange expression for a moment, before he realized that all eyes were already on him. Quickly, he stood up straight and deliberately cleared his throat, while his expression changed to his typical wide, warm smile. "At ease," he loudly said, causing at least 40 shoulders in the room to drop slightly at once. "I'm not really here in any official fashion. However, I have noticed some unrest ever since we received the transmission of James Aldwin, and I wanted to address it with you. All of you." He threw a quick glance to Nia and the group of off-worlders in the room's corner before he continued. "The situation is this. As you may have imagined, the ambassador's message hasn't gone unnoticed on Earth either. Right after the feed was received, a general information lock-in was declared, and filters for any outgoing flow of data into the community were put in place. It was decided that whoever is behind Aldwin's distress, they must not learn of his call for help from Earth's side. This was put in place to buy us and him time, while our governments decided on a future course of action." He began his address, and his gaze slowly wandered across the faces of his subordinates as he spoke. "In the meantime, humans from everywhere in the galaxy were, at least temporarily, recalled to human territories, and the military presence at our borders has been increased. Earth is officially on high alert." He paused for a moment, which his soldiers immediately understood to be a moment he granted them to talk among themselves. Heads were turned, and a general mumble of hushed whispers in several diverse languages broke out within the room, as everyone wanted to hear everyone else's opinion on the topic. Shida, Moore, Curie, and Conglorge all looked over at Nia. However, the young woman was already on her way over to the commander. The large man leaned in towards her, and turned his head so she could speak into his ear, while the general noise of the room made it hard to understand each other. However, Shida's ears were fine enough that they could still pick up on what was being said. "Does that mean we're being recorded as well?" Nia asked the large man, an expression of worry on her face, as she glanced over her shoulder towards the Offworlders. "I am getting to that," Kieran informed her with a warm, reassuring tone. He stood up straight again, and loudly cleared his throat once more, silencing the room at an instant. "Be that as it may, as of today we have gotten new orders," he loudly said, as all eyes in the room were glued to his lips. "The UHSDF has sent out a ship towards Osnajar to make contact with Aldwin. As the closest ship to the Galactic Core right now, we are to remain on standby for the moment, and to provide backup should it be needed." Shida listened up. If backup could be needed, that meant something was finally happening. Kieran took another pause, as some soldiers looked around confusedly. "If we are the closest ship, why has another been sent out here?" One of the higher-ranking soldiers finally came forward, seemingly speaking for most people in the room. "Why can't we go there to make contact?" Some agreeing noises came from the other soldiers, and most of them nodded in concurrence with their comrade, while looking at their commander for answers. Kieran's smile turned to a knowing one, as he had apparently expected this question to come up. "Much as it pains me to say it, this situation is not only very delicate, but also very much outside of our pay grade," the commander informed his subordinates. "It is to be handled by nobody, but handpicked individuals specifically chosen by the governments. Besides, much as I love our dear Salem, our dear little canoe isn't exactly up to a task meant for a battleship." The soldiers seemed to be taken aback, and it almost seemed like a single question was on everyone's mind, but nobody was asking it. The one to finally get out with it was Nia. "Then, what ship are they sending?" she asked loudly into the room, and it almost seemed like the soldiers were holding their breath, waiting for an answer. Keown smirked with a soft chuckle, and paused dramatically before he replied. Only slowly, he lifted his head, and casually let his gaze glide across the faces in the room. "They are sending the sun," he then informed everybody, in a matter-of-fact tone. This time the soldiers didn't wait for a pause on his side before they started to whisper and mumble amongst each other. Some even broke their semi-ordered formation to form small groups and stick their heads together. "The sun?" Shida asked, and turned her head towards Conglorge, who seemed to be just as surprised and impressed to hear that name as many of the humans did. The Tornastrosite let out a low bellow before he answered. "It is one of the humans' flagships. I think, third largest one in their arsenal, if I'm not mistaken. A ship of the Atrocity class. Its actual name is a lot longer, but I can't recall it right now. Something in a human language?" Atrocity class? Interesting designation for a battleship. Before Shida could ask any more questions, she noticed that Nia and Keown were coming back over toward the group, and she respectfully turned towards the commander, waiting and seeing what he had to say. "As to you four," Keown loudly announced himself once he came into reasonable distance for conversation, and looked at each Offworlder individually before his eyes finally settled on Shida. "With the new information and evidence that has come out supporting your story, as well as another review of your personal files, you have officially been granted sanctuary by the territories of humanity, specifically the Sovereignty Mars. I'm sorry that it has taken so long, but our bureaucracy likes to be thorough. Congratulations, you are once again free people." He reached out one of his large, dark hands with a wide smile towards Shida. After a moment of hesitation, she took his hand, feeling his strong grip as he shook it energetically. "And what exactly does that mean for us now?" Moore asked from behind Shida, and everyone else also looked at the man curiously. Kieran's smile faded ever so slightly, and he looked at the soldiers who still seemed to be busy with discussing the current turn of events. Surreptitiously he leaned in and signaled for everyone to come a bit closer. "Well, that's all a bit up to you right now," he said, hushed, while glancing over his shoulder and making sure nobody was listening in too closely. "Officially, we still have your ship ready to take you to Mars before we embark on our mission. You know, there shouldn't really be civilians on board during something like this. However, given the unique situation, I have gotten some unofficial permissions. Under the hand and off the books, if you understand. Any of you that wants to leave, well, you're more than free to do so. It'll be some sweat off my back at least. However, if you want to stick around, well,
That's up to you now.
Shida exchanged some glances with her friends, and especially Nia seemed quite ruminative hearing that.
Take your time with your decision. Your ship isn't going anywhere,
Kyo reassured them, and pulled his head back, standing at his full height once more.
For now, you don't have to stay on this level of the ship anymore. Any cleared area is now open to you. However, for anyone who can't handle high gravity, or is too big to fit through human-sized structures, well, I would recommend still sticking to the lower decks, for obvious reasons.
He nodded towards Moore and Konglorch, and the two understandingly nodded back at him. Then Kyo turned specifically towards Shida once more.
If you, however, would like to get your muscles out of their funk again, I can get you a room upstairs, he informed her, and then nodded at Nia. You can get the one next to hers.
I'll think about it, Shida replied hesitantly. It had been a while since she had been to a super high gravity area, much of her life in fact. She wasn't quite sure if she could even handle it anymore, although she had kept in shape with training. Kyo nodded again, then he walked back to his previous position in front of the door, and a third time, he loudly cleared his throat. His soldiers fell silent again and shot around in the same choreographed manner from before.
Well, everybody, we're setting the new course soon. Once the mission begins, I would like for all of you to be fresh and ready, so lights out is early today,
the commander loudly informed in his most commanding tone. His soldiers took his word as gospel, and immediately started to clear out of the room, although some were still bickering among themselves. Kyo took one last look over at the remaining group, gave an encouraging nod, and finally also stepped out of the room. A moment of silence followed. It was finally broken by a high, synthetic voice simply stating, "I'm not leaving. James will need a new arm when he comes back." Everyone turned to Curie, as it was the first time they had spoken up since everyone had met here. She'd thought about that for a moment, and then she sighed. "Damn, he's probably going to want one, isn't he?" she said with a slight shudder. She tried to avoid imagining James with a metal arm in front of her inner eye, but had little success, as her mind conjured up all sorts of grotesque metal limbs attached to her boyfriend's shoulder. "Oh, definitely," Nia agreed, apparently without quite realizing why that wasn't an altogether pleasant thought. Shida shuddered once more. James becoming a cyborg was something she would likely have to digest for a while. "Well, anyway, I'm not leaving either," she said, trying to steer the conversation away from the topic of cybernetics. A general consensus of, "Neither am I," echoed back at her from her surrounding friends. However, after a moment of silence, Moore spoke up a bit more meekly.
"Although now that we are no longer detained, I wonder if it would be okay for the humans if I called my family. I'm sure my children are worried sick by now. The last talk we had was not exactly encouraging," she said, with a deep worry in her voice, a claw slowly gliding through the non-woven parts of her now well-groomed fur. That made Konglorch also speak up. "While my old crew has likely moved on by now, I should still get it out there that I am still very much alive," he concurred with Moore, starting to push himself to his feet. Nia scratched over her chin with her thumb. "Well, the general information lock-in is still in effect, but I'm sure we can figure something out so you can at least let people know you're alive and well. If you want, I can talk to Kyo about it in your place," she offered the giants, and Konglorch immediately let out an approving bellow. Moore also bobbed her big head up and down excitedly, her braided fur flying around widely. "That would be very much appreciated." She thankfully accepted Nia's proposition. Shida and Curie turned towards each other for a moment. They didn't really have anyone to call. Anyone that would care that they were still alive was either on the enemy's side or in danger themselves, and should better not be contacted by them. "I'll see what can be done," Nia informed the giants reassuringly. She then turned to Shida and Curie. "Either of you want to come along? From what I understand, you can handle the gravity just fine," she asked the two candidly. "Want to take a look at the bridge?" "Yes," Curie immediately and eagerly replied, apparently ready to go right then and there. It wasn't surprising. After all, they had had to significantly curb their curiosity ever since they arrived here, having been confined to this single area of the ship for weeks. Shida rubbed along her arm with her hand and looked at the ground. The upper decks would be even more full of humans than down here. "I think I will sit this one out," she began. However, in a sudden burst of energy, she stopped in the middle of the sentence, her hand gripping down and punching the skin of her arm. Right now, she was officially taking sanctuary in human territories. The humans had taken her in when she knew no one else would have. Even her boyfriend was a human, for goodness sake. If there was ever a time when she would have to suck it up and try to get used to the primates, it was now. Especially since she wouldn't be able to live off of someone else's charity for too long. Sooner or later, she would have to get to work, if only for her sanity's sake.
So she might as well try to leave a good impression with a human commander right now. So she quickly corrected herself. I mean, sure. It's not like I've got anything better to do. She didn't miss the doubtful looks her friends gave her as she said that. However, Nia's face instead showed an encouraging smile. All right then, we'll be right back, Nia said, gesturing for Curie and Sheeta to follow her, while she waved Moore and Conglorge. Curie immediately scuttled after her at a brisk pace, and after a moment of hesitation, and already becoming unsure of her previous decision, Sheeta followed suit. Meanwhile, still many light years away but approaching rapidly, another human ship was tearing through the void and towards the galaxy's core. The Sun, as her name was commonly shortened to among the human military, was the fastest ship humanity had ever produced, and was able to cross the galaxy at a near-record pace. On board, among the thousands of crew members she housed, a team of 4 humans were putting their heads together over a computer terminal built into a large table, their mission parameters laid out in front of them. Well, who would have guessed that we'd be reunited quite like this? First Lieutenant Admir Rexa, a young man with tan skin and brown hair, commented, while looking down at the haggard and unkempt face of James Aldwin. The picture was a screenshot, taken for the big speech he gave about becoming a politician. Buzz does have a knack for getting himself in some shit, Captain Samantha Anderson, a tall blonde woman with fair skin and long hair, replied. Personally, I always figured we'd only see his ugly mug again when it's time to pull it out once again. She leaned over and dragged one of the files towards her with long fingers, opening it up and letting her eyes glide over the preliminary mission briefing. Although I do have to say, this is a bit bigger than even I imagined, she added, ruminatively chewing on the back of the pen she was holding in her left hand. Well, you can finally repay him for all the times he had to save your butt, right, Sam? Admir mocked her with a quick wink, causing Sam to give him an annoyed look. Their older leader, Major Andrzej Kochukaru, let out an exasperated sigh and stood up from his chair and picked up a mug of coffee from the table. Stop your bickering. We've all saved each other's butts at some point. This time won't be any different. He admonished the two, before taking a long sip of the hot beverage. His long, dark blonde hair was bound into a tight ponytail, and his modified crimson eyes stared down at the picture of his used-to-be trainee. So, that's actually him? That's the guy I'm constantly being compared to? The fourth and final person in the room, First Lieutenant Tuya Baitar, a shorter woman with short green hair and a pierced nose, spoke up. Immediately, Admir leaned over towards her, wrapped his arm around her shoulder, and pressed his cheek into hers while cooing, Tuya, you know we love you. He then pressed a kiss against the side of her head before she managed to push him away from her, with an annoyed yet amused eye roll. Ignoring their spiel, Andres took another sip from his mug before he replied. Yup, that's Carbonado, better known as James Aldwin. He's the man you replaced when you joined the team. Tuya said, taking another look at the large, gaunt-looking man. I imagined him differently. Admir turned his back to the table, leaning his arms and back onto it while looking up at the room's dark ceiling. Well, he didn't always look like that, he said, clearly delving into memories with a look of nostalgia on his face. Yeah, he had both arms back in the day, Sam chimed in, pulling Admir's head out of the clouds, causing him to shoot her a venomous look. However, it soon vanished from his face again, as he got caught in his own thoughts once again. It's been so long, he mused to himself, a hand dreamily on his cheek. I wonder what he looks like underneath all that hair today. Sam made a mocking, gagging motion at the insinuation behind that, pointing into her open mouth while looking over at Tuya, who gave her a brief smirk before returning her attention to their mission. Well, according to the briefing, he has a girlfriend now, she commented, summing up a picture of this Sheeta that was currently housed aboard the Salem. The face of the alien cat lady looked quite displeased at having her photo taken, which was something Tuya could sympathize with. Can we maybe get back to the topic at hand? Andrzej finally chimed in, loudly setting his mug down on the table as he leaned over it, putting both hands onto the terminal's surface. You know, our job? His three subordinates turned towards the table and sat up straight in their seat, indicating that they were now entering business mode. Andrzej nodded. I take it that during your playing the round you found some time to actually look at the briefing? He asked with a faint vexation in his voice. His team nodded and looked at him intently. He looked at each of their faces for any doubts or second thoughts. Finding none, he continued. Well, you're all experts, so it's far from me to tell you how to do your jobs. And if you have any preferences when it comes to their role in this play, The first friendly face he sees in Mumps probably shouldn't be mine. Sam immediately came forward, while stroking some of her hair out of her face. And Buzz doesn't know Tuya yet, so she probably shouldn't go in there either. That only leaves you or Admir as the lead. She wasn't wrong. Although Andrej knew well that she and James got along far better than she made it seem, she had far better reasons not to go in there herself. He looked at Admir expectantly, waiting to see if he had any thoughts on the matter. Admir leaned back in his chair and put his hands behind his head. I hate jumping Baumgartner style anyway, he commented in a literal laid-back manner, opening just one eye to look up at Andrej. Is it okay for you if I go in, boss? Andrej scoffed. I won't complain about not being at the front lines, he laughed, and then turned his attention towards Tuya. If James had to be in anyone's crosshairs, he'd want it to be Sam's. So what do you say, Tuya? Are you in for a road trip with your old boss? Tuya smiled a cheeky smile. I never say no to getting to drive an ATC, she replied, with a thumbs up at the Major. Andrej then looked over at Sam. Any objections, Captain? He asked her, with an open palm in her direction. Sam shook her head. I'd much rather the gal on the right side of the barrel anyway, she said, waving off any concern he might have had. Andrej brought 2 fingers to his temple, and then towards the captain, before leaning over the table once again and adding the new information of the role everyone would take in the mission to the mission logs. Get familiar with the mission's area, he ordered, as he was making his inputs. I know that positions of routes have been scouted for us beforehand, but while I love our intel, I trust you a lot more when it comes to knowing what you can and can't do, so I'd like to hear if any of you have a better position for themselves in mind. The team concurred and fell silent for a moment, as everyone looked over the map they had taken from the Galactic Network. With the exception of Admir, who took one quick glance at the map, and then leaned back once again. I'm guessing the Leader Supreme has yet to upload her room tour, huh? He commented, pointing towards the large blank area that showed, or more precisely didn't show, the absolutely monumental estate of the Leader Supreme that James was supposedly being held in. He grinned widely, as Tuya snorted next to him, satisfied that his joke had landed with at least one person. I'm afraid you're right, Andrej confirmed, also taking a quick glance at the large blank area on the map that was mini-labelled Mission Goal. The layout of the Leader Supreme's estate is vastly unknown and apparently a quite well-kept secret. So far, Intel hasn't managed to get their hands on anything more concrete than word of mouth. Great, that's reassuring, Admin replied, and opened the file containing anything they actually did know about that forsaken place he was supposed to get James out of. One thing was clear. They would only be able to reveal themselves once they had a surefire way of getting out of there, because there was no way they'd open any door that was designed for a Zadaitos without the help of one. Next to him, he noticed Sam browsing through James's file once again. Anything troubling you? He asked his teammate, leaning his head over to her, trying to peek at what she was trying to find in there. Sam didn't reply to him, but looked up to the Major instead. Do we have any idea why Buzz isn't just getting out of there? She asked, with a serious look on her face. Tuya raised an eyebrow at her. You mean, apart from all the literally heavily armed guards he's surrounded by? She commented comically. Sam didn't dignify her reaction with a response, instead keeping up her stern look at the Major. You know what I mean. She solidified her stance again, and Andrej took a deep breath. Slowly, he shook his head. We have no idea, he admitted. Whatever it is they have on him, it is enough to keep him in line. You've seen it yourself. Even the call for help he did get out was half-assed. Sam nodded and returned her attention to the mission files. What's going on with you, Buzz? She quietly whispered to herself. I mean, who knows what he's even like anymore? Tuya commented, suddenly pulling all eyes in the room onto herself. Some of the looks were darker than others, and she quickly raised her hands, waving them defensively in front of herself. I mean, come on. A lot can happen in 5 years. Hell, that's longer than you've even known him. Maybe he's just mellowed out over time. The rest of the team exchanged some considering looks with each other. Maybe, Andrej finally replied, rubbing his temple thoughtfully, but I somehow doubt it. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. He called for help and it's our mission to get him out of there. Out of the entire military, he's going to trust us the most. So if there's anyone he'll trust to get things handled, it's us. Whatever they have on him, he'll help us in getting that sorted out as well. And if not, well, we've been mindful of it so far, but unless it's something really big, that well is running dry. One way or the other, we have a job to do. Andrej then shifted his gaze towards Admir once again. By now, who also know the estate like the back of his hand, I bet. So as soon as you're in there, you'll have a map right by your side, he assured the first lieutenant, and Admir gave him a thumbs up. Suddenly, Sam sat up a bit straighter in her seat. Wait, am I seeing this right? She asked loudly, looking up at her boss excitedly and pointing at a single line of text in the document, next to which was a green field stating, "Permitted. We have permission to use our Rs. How am I only seeing this now?" Andres smirked and crossed his arms. "Well, it was a big game we're hunting," he replied with a shrug. "Gonna need a big gun for that." In an uncharacteristically excited moment of her, she made a quick "yes" gesture by forming a fist and thrusting her elbow downwards. "Curb your murder fingers," Andres warned her with a sigh, while rubbing his eyes with two knuckles. "It will remain set to in-atmosphere mode constantly, and just because you're allowed to use it doesn't mean you should. Any shot fired with that thing has to be permitted by me first." "Yes, sir," Sam replied, clearly so excited about possibly getting to fire the handheld calamity that humanity called a weapon. "That means she's going to aim that thing at me," Anime commented, in a mixture of boredom and concern. "Ooh, happy days." He then glanced up at Sam and gave her a quick wink. Sam softly clapped against his shoulder with the back of her hand, and Admir laughed as he brushed her hand away. "Well, we still have some time to optimize the plan." Andres finalized the meeting with a single clap of his hands. "We're scheduled to meet up with the Salem within the week. We're heading towards the planet Osnajar afterwards. If we're lucky, they won't be expecting us yet. The element of surprise is always good to have." "They'll see us coming a mile away," Tua commented, leaning back in her seat and putting her feet on the table. Andres laughed a hoarse laugh. "Probably," he agreed with a wide grin, rubbing the back of his head. On planet Osnajar, James looked up at the young man he had been stuck talking to for the last hour or so confusedly. Next to him, the matriarch seemed all too happy with herself while listening to the ramblings of the human on the screen in front of her. "Splendid!" she said excitedly. "I'm sure once James has found his place in the council, we will also be able to find his place for you. Eager young people like yourself are always a welcome addition to our teams on the station." The blonde youngster's face lit up, his eyes shining as he stared at the matriarch's face and replied, "That'd be absolutely awesome. That'd be wonderful, Leader Supreme. I can imagine no higher honor." "Oh, please," Tua gave back and waved her trunk dismissively. "No need to be formal. I'm sure James would love having someone like you by his side." James was a bit too lost in thought to reply, and he felt the soft nudge of a wooden crutch against his leg, putting him out of his own mind. Right," he said, forcing a smile on his face as he returned the over-enthused gaze of the young man. "I'm sure you make a great addition to my team, Alexander." A giddiness came over the young man's face that made James really uncomfortable in his own skin. He was flooding his own brain, trying to remember old protocols, but he came up short. Alexander Page was no codename he had ever heard of. He was sure of it. So was this guy really just a weirdo that somehow had managed to make contact with the Leader Supreme? It seemed that way, although it was hard to believe. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, making the heads of all three people in the room turn towards it. Some quick glances were exchanged, and finally the matriarch decided she would be the one to answer, or James Reprig would keep Alexander company. James constantly squinted and peeked over at the massive form of the matriarch, barely paying attention to the other human in front of him, just nodding along with whatever he was saying. He was quite impressed when he realized that the person on the other side of the door was none other than Yrrol. That had to mean something big was going on, and whatever he had to say that was so important that he would even interrupt one of the matriarch's meetings for it, it didn't seem to make her happy at all. By now, even Alexander seemed to realize that something had to be going on, and his constant dribble of noise slowly died down. "Is everything all right?" he asked, with a mild concern in his voice and on his face. James turned back to the screen, planning to just quickly turn him away with some half-assed excuse. However, someone else was faster than him. "I'm terribly sorry, Alexander, but the ambassador is a very busy man, and it seems we have gone and forgot the time," Tua loudly announced, as she hurried back over to James at a brisk pace. "I hope you can forgive us if we have to cut this a bit short." James noticed a nervous movement of her ears, and interestedly raised an eyebrow at her sudden hurry to get this talk over with. Not that he had any objections. "Oh, of course not," Alexander quickly replied, raising his hands conciliatorily. "I won't want to keep any of you from your work. We'll stay in contact?" "Of course," Tua replied, sickly sweet, but clearly with an underlying tone of rushness. "Success to you." "Success to you," Alex tried to get out, but was cut short when the call was quite suddenly ended. James and Reprig both looked at the darkened screen for a second longer, and then turned their heads towards Tua. "Something the matter?" James asked, whether Tua didn't answer. Instead, she merely stuttered at the screen once again, immediately beginning to make another call. In the meantime, Yrrol had opened the door fully and was stepping into the room. In the past days, the bull had visited the estate almost daily, most of the time doing little more but trying to provoke James to do something stupid, so he could try to punish him. Too bad for him that James was trained in not losing his cool, and against some brute just looking for an opportunity to lash out at him, it was much easier than against anyone calculated enough to know which buttons they could push with him. Still, today's visit somehow seemed different than his usual ones. Like this one actually had a purpose behind it. James exchanged a quick glance with Reprieve, but even the rodent could only shrug at him, with his eyes wide open. Apparently, this really was something that had come up on short notice. Within seconds of Tua starting the new call, the face of another Zoditos appeared on screen. They seemed shorter and stockier than the ones James had seen before, and their tusks were a lot straighter. He wondered if maybe they came from a different part of the planet. "Greetings, High Matriarch," she said nervously, as soon as she realised a connection had been made. "I take it my message has reached you." Tua lifted her trunk and annoyedly waved it around, in a gesture signalling to move along already. "Yes, I'm aware," she said in barely suppressed, irritated haste. "Now tell me what we are dealing with." "A human ship. Very large and inbound in our direction. Fast." The other Zoditos immediately replied in brief and certain terms. James noticed a quick, dark glance from the matriarch coming down onto him, and he could do nothing but look back up at her and shrug. He knew just as much as she did. Well, almost. "And have they made contact yet?" the matriarch inquired further, letting off of James for the moment. "Yes," the Zoditos on the other side of the line replied, quickly checking some sort of note next to her. "That's why I contacted you immediately. They've asked to talk to you and the ambassador. Apparently they're an escort for, well, another ambassador. He's here to talk to Ambassador Aldwin, as he says, face to face. At the pace they are going, they will arrive at the planet within 2 days' time." The matriarch looked down at James once again, and he looked back up at her with an excusatory expression. "Well, you can't say I didn't tell you that my people would be weird about it," he said conciliatorily. "At least they're willing to talk to us now." Tua seemed to think about that for a moment, while Dorfriend looked at James angrily, still not liking the tone James was taking with his boss every time. James got ready to dodge a possible lash of a large trunk, but for the moment, none came. After a moment of contemplation, Tua seemed to come to the conclusion that this turn of events was indeed concerning, but at least possibly not altogether unpleasant. After all, humanity being ready for talks was something that she had been waiting for quite a while. Although her expression still told of her not trusting this situation just like this. She turned back to the screen. "And what is the name of the ship they are sending?" she asked interestedly. The woman on the screen quickly rubbed her forehead with the tips of her trunk. "I'm sorry, but I'm not quite sure," she excused herself, and looked at her notes intently. "The name is in some form of Earth dialect, and the translation software is still rough around the edges. I think it's called something like Location Within Starlight?" All the colour drained from James's face, and he couldn't keep his expression from changing. Why that ship? Were they crazy? Were they trying to start a damn war? "Someone you know?" Reprieve asked, also gaining the matriarch's attention. James swallowed heavily. "A place in the sun," he replied. "What?" the matriarch asked, seeming interested but also confused at the sun outburst. James needed to swallow once more. "That's the ship's name," he repeated himself, this time more clearly. "She's called A Place in the Sun."